Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Welcome everybody to CSIS. My name is Moises Randon. I'm the director of the Future Venezuela Initiative and Fellow of the Americas program. This is part of a series of virtual events to shed light on an unprecedented humanitarian crisis that Venezuela is going through. And just for the record, we will be posting a complete video on our website of this event, if not today, by Monday. So we will post a commentary as well about the discussion today, sometime next week. And we're discussing today the role of corruption in Venezuela with a focus on the recent arrest of Alex Saab. For those who are not following us closely, on Friday, June 12th, Cabo Verde authorities arrested Colombian businessman Alex Saab, who is accused of corruption schemes with Nicolás Maduro regime by authorities in Colombia and the US. Allegedly, he was detained when his plane stopped for gas in Cabo Verde, and Saab has been accused in several corruption and money laundering cases. He's known for being one of Maduro's middlemen, which has granted him immense power in Venezuela, and enough power to harass and force journalists into exile, including those journalists from the website Armando Info. Among other things, Alex Saab is known to be behind an important corruption scheme behind the politically motivated subsidized food distribution system called CLAP, or Local Committees for Supply and Production. We're going to discuss about that later today. But again, this is the event today is the basis for a broader discussion about corruption networks and how these networks have been propping up the Maduro regime as well. And for that, we have three incredible speakers who have important knowledge about all of these dynamics. First, we're going to hear from Ambassador Vanessa Neumann, and she's the ad honorem representative of the interim government of Venezuela to the United Kingdom and Ireland. She's the president and CEO of Asymmetrica, a political risk consulting firm, and has studied crime terror pipelines, as well as organized crime and corruption within the Chavez and the Maduro governments. Ambassador Neumann previously served on the OECD Task Force on Countering Illicit Trade. Thank you, Vanessa, for joining. Joshua Goodman is our second speaker. He's a Latin American correspondent at the Associated Press, or AP, and previously oversaw the AP's coverage of Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. He was previously a reporter at Bloomberg, and throughout his career in journalism, Mr. Goodman has conducted investigative research into Venezuela's corruption networks, including the Alex Saab case. And finally, but not least, Fernando Kutz is a senior associate at the Cohen Group and previously served as a senior advisor to the National Security Advisor, Lieutenant General McMaster, and Deputy National Security Advisor to Major General Rick Wado. Mr. Kutz was the director for South America at the White House National Security Council and previously held various posts at USAID. He's currently a global fellow at the Wilson Center Latin American Program. Thank you, Fernando, and thank you, Josh, for joining today as well. For those on the audience, we're gonna have time for questions. Just submit your questions through the link on our website, and I'm sure we're gonna get at least some of those, if not most. Well, Vanessa, let's start with you. Thank you again. What exactly has Alex Saab has done for the Maduro regime, and how was he involved in the CLAP scheme?
Thank you very much for having me. Coming back to CSIS feels a bit like a homecoming. I want to be very careful about not overly politicizing today's conversation and focus on the criminality, of which there is plenty. Alex Saab is a figure who basically increasingly made his money from the growing corruption under Chavez and then Maduro. He is a man who has basically made an absolute fortune profiting from the suffering of the Venezuelan people, which is interesting to note. As the suffering increased, he personally got much richer. He started out first, his first entry into the Venezuelan corruption networks is basically through the construction program. So what looked like, and that's really when se descontroló, when we sort of lost control of the finance department of PDVSA, when they start to use it after 2002 as a bit of a slush fund, when PDVSA got militarized, and start using that money to build these Barrio Adentro, Misión Vivienda, all of these sort of public housing contracts. And a lot of those contracts, we know they were not fulfilled, a lot of the housing didn't appear. And so he starts, as a Colombian businessman, as a well-connected Colombian businessman, starts selling construction goods to the Chavez regime as part of this construction project. And then what happens is, from that point on, he gets increasingly involved in every single poverty reduction program that really becomes a deeper corruption network for the Chavistas, and he and makes more and more money. The way then he moves on from the construction program into CLAP. So in CLAP, he becomes the liaison also by setting up shell companies in Mexico and in Panama to win these no-bid contracts to fill the boxes of food. And then the boxes of food then were filled, they were first in Mexico, and then they were filled in Turkey, which also then starts to provide a bit of a nexus to Iran. It's sort of an evolving network, and also through shell companies that he had in Asia. So he becomes increasingly savvy, increasingly geopolitically connected in order to provide this sort of illicit finance network. The boxes of CLAP are a form of social repression, as well as buying the loyalty of the military. What happens is that the people are so poor that they rely on these boxes to eat, and then the boxes, but the military profits from the shell companies, and they also then sell them onto the black market. And then he moves from there to the oil, the so-called oil for food program, which brings him deeper into connections with Iran, and now he's doing the gold for gasoline. So as the Venezuelan corruption and suffering increases, he becomes richer, and he becomes sort of the go-to man for Maduro and for Chavez, and then for Maduro to fix their problems, And my concern, to wrap up quickly, is the problem with corruption in Venezuela is two things. As the suffering has increased, the schemes for corruption have increased, which has created the perverse incentive that the more the Venezuelan people suffer, the more these networks profit from them, and the more it keeps Maduro in power. And he's also a prime example of how easy it is to transform to that illicit business moves faster than real business. He just sets up one shell company after another in one jurisdiction after another, and helps the Maduro regime evade sanctions. The problem with the corruption networks that he has been a part of is that they provide a national security threat for Venezuela, because corruption allows the entry point of these foreign interests. So now, for instance, Iran is working with him to get to expand its influence, and behind Iran is really actually Russia and China, because he's the entry point into the regime. And as I say, it's a violation of human rights. So I think I'd rather sort of leave it at that for now, and then I'm happy to take further questions.
Sure, thank you, Vanessa, thank you. Josh, you have been looking at Alex Saab case for quite a bit. So how do you think this arrest is a game changer for Venezuela, and how has the Maduro regime reacted so far?
Okay, thank you, Moises and CSIS, for the invitation. I'm going to get to your question, but I just kind of wanted to provide a little bit more of general background on the U.S. justice system's growing interest in criminal activity in Venezuela. Just like Pablo Escobar in the 1980s, there's no place a corrupt Venezuelan fears more than a U.S. jail cell. And the extraterritorial reach of the U.S. justice system is incredibly unique. There's no other country in the world that pursues human rights abuses, corruption, crimes outside its borders as aggressively as the United States. But with that powerful tool, the U.S. federal criminal indictment, comes the responsibility to calibrate how it's used to make sure that the US system maintains its integrity, which is the basis of so much. So, basically other countries don't go around the world picking up foreign businessmen for paying bribes to government officials abroad. But that's essentially what is happening here with the Alex Saab case. He's charged with doing just that. And his preference for real estate and banking in Miami is really the only grounds for US jurisdiction in this case. The unilateral use of sanctions and the targeting of individuals who violate them is another highly contentious use of prosecutorial discretion. Critics in the US call it lawfare, and it's really the byproduct of decades of the US having assigned itself a role of the world's policeman, which, it's debatable, that's my point. I want to state clearly that I'm not raising any doubts whatsoever about due process in the cases against corrupt Venezuelans. I speak on a daily basis to law enforcement officials who are incredibly professional and really just do their job, which is following the evidence. They don't have any consideration for politics. It plays no role. But in the court of public opinion, it's a completely different issue. And there are political ramifications that arise from the use of indictments that aren't always desirable and don't always actually serve the pursuit of justice. Unfortunately, the US tradition of judicial independence and respect for the rule of law is lost on many Venezuelans. I think it's a combination of too many Hollywood movies, and because Venezuela's own justice system is so broken, both Maduro supporters and government opponents alike increasingly are trying to weaponize indictments for political gain. And that's an important consideration in the Saab case as well. In the US, there's also very obvious incentives to go after high value targets now in Venezuela. Look no further than the White House. And as John Bolton told us recently, President Trump found the idea of invading Venezuela quite cool. From my place as a journalist, I've seen a whole cottage industry of US prosecutors, government officials, politicians in multiple cities around the US who compete with each other on a daily basis to see who's tougher on Venezuela. I should add, this is a bit break from the past administrations. Without the same political cover, many thought that until Trump arrived at the White House, the wheels of justice were actually moving too slowly against corrupt officials in Venezuela and the oligarch businessmen who finance them. I'm sure Fernando, he's got the best knowledge of the before and after scenarios, and he can tell us more about that. But it's extremely important in the current environment of escalating confrontation between the two countries that the evidence collected against high-value targets, not just Saab, but all of them, be extremely strong. I spoke recently to Dick Gregory, the Miami prosecutor, former Miami prosecutor who indicted Noriega in Panama, and he gave me a quote that he had been told years ago when he was prosecuting Noriega, and he said, when you shoot a king, you better have a big bullet. And collecting evidence in these cases is extremely difficult the higher you move up the food chain. There's hostilities between the two countries. We know there's no information or judicial cooperation with Maduro. And a lot of these actions, however deplorable, are arguably covered by sovereign immunity. So I'm not saying that the US is overusing indictments, but I do think it's something we have to guard against or risk our justice system being seen as vindictive or politicized. It's not lost on anyone that even while we're seeing a boom in Venezuelan prosecutions right now, including the indictment against Maduro and the 14 senior officials the other day, the president of Honduras, a Trump ally, has remained untouched despite serious evidence of drug trafficking brought up in his own brother's narcotics trial. So on Saab, I just wanted to say that, what we're seeing today may look very different in a few weeks. It's not surprising nobody from the White House or State Department is here today. And I think that's because, they don't want to be seen as dancing in the end zone on this one. I saw in the immediate aftermath of Saab's arrest, people, the Venezuelan opposition, especially on social media, really celebrating. But I think for everyone, there's a cautionary tale here in what happened to Hugo Carvajal, Hugo Chavez's former spy chief. He's managed to escape a US warrant on narcotics of no less on 2 occasions, first in Aruba and now in Spain, and nobody knows where he is right now. So, extraditions are not simple cases. There's lots of non-judicial factors at play. In the case of Cape Verde, a country I don't know much about, but I understand Russia and China play a very influential role. And then there's Saab's argument itself, which has been sort of foreshadowed by his attorney, which is that, he had a diplomatic passport and was on an official mission to buy food and medicine. I think that's going to be a hard argument to defeat in a foreign court. So just to wrap up, I mean, the U.S. is a country known for the rule of law that gives us incredible power to deliver justice around the world. But using those tools entails huge risks if they are abused. And I think in the best, it works when you're using prosecutorial discretion aligned with a government that shares the same goals. And of course, to me, the essential example in Latin America is Colombia, which over 2 decades has extradited thousands of drug traffickers to the US because it wanted to resolve the problem, but didn't have the capacity at the time to prosecute all these people. In the case of Venezuela, no cooperation is on the horizon with Maduro for sure. So, one has to make sure that these criminal indictments don't become an instrument of regime change that the US and others are unable to accomplish through traditional foreign policy tools. You need to look no further than the example of the invasion of Panama, which people forget, but was partly justified by Noriega's drug indictment, to understand that there sometimes are unintended and violent consequences that can arise. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Points well taken. Also, there's an interesting point too, because it's not only the U.S. No, Colombia is also we're asking to arrest Alex Saab, at least on his case. So we have 2 countries looking for his case. But now moving to the extradition issue, and I'm glad we have Fernando for this. He has great experience working at the government and NSC. I'm sure you have experiences on this, Fernando. But Cape Verde and the United States do not have an extradition treaty. What will the legal process look like to extradite Alex Saab to the U.S.? And if Saab is extradited to the U.S., how will this impact the international community pressure campaign against the Maduro regime, and especially looking at what Saab information may have access to? But thanks for joining.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you very much for having me, Moises and CSIS. Great to be on the panel with the ambassador and with Josh, and looking forward to a good discussion. Let me start by going very big picture, if you don't mind, and talking about corruption in Venezuela and just how important and prescient it is and how it sustains the lifeblood of Maduro. And then I'll narrow things down a little bit, and I'll get to your question, I promise, Moises. And if I don't, keep me to it. But I'll start by saying, big picture, just how important corruption is in Venezuela. We have in the last kind of couple of years, I think, a lot of us, and I think Moises, you're one of those people, have started to reference Venezuela as a mafia state. And I think sometimes it's lost on folks who aren't paying as close of attention to Venezuela as to why it is that we reference it as a mafia state. It's a small circle of high-level individuals who keep all of the power, and they keep all of the power because they keep all of the money. And I don't mean, they keep the money in their pockets. I mean, they steal the money away from, all of the things that should be going to the people, or should be going, natural resources should be going to the businesses or the communities. And instead, they line their pockets with it. So it's a cabal, a small circle of individuals that keep all of that power and all of that money, and thus they repress their people, they repress whatever else is out there to make sure that they stay in power. So that's why I do believe that referencing it as a mafia state is fair. Now, where does that money come from, right? It's important to understand. I mean, again, I said it's everywhere, but what does everywhere mean? Well, there's been numerous studies on this stuff, and I think the best analysis I found on the oil sector, at least from PDVSA, is that about as of 2016, I should say, $1.2 billion a year was being stolen from PDVSA to help with the corrupt regime. Okay, so that's just oil. Now, then you look at a study that said that out of food, energy, transportation, and health, the government has been taking about $3 billion a year. $3 billion a year. Now, again, that's food, energy, transportation, and health. Some people would argue people shouldn't try to take corrupt money away from that. But, again, this regime's a little reckless and brutal. And so that's $3 billion a year. And then on top of that, you get gold, you have mining, you have the drug trade, which is huge going out through Venezuela because it's open terrain. And that's all dark money. We don't know how much is coming out from that. We don't know how much money is transferring around from that. And in 2017, as you all might remember, there was a CNN report that broke this news publicly, but we found out that there were even fake passports being sold by Venezuelan diplomats as part of the regime efforts to secure more corrupt money for themselves. So what does that all tally up to? I think the most conservative estimates out there, when you add all of that up, is something in the $6 to $7 billion a year range. And it's probably more than that, but let's just keep it very conservative and say it's $6 to $7 billion a year. What does that mean for Venezuela? In 2019, Venezuela's GDP was $70 billion. So we're saying that 10% of Venezuela's GDP, at a minimum, 10% of Venezuela's GDP is going to state-sanctioned corruption. That's huge. That's incredible, right? That's unbelievable, especially in a country that is going through a humanitarian crisis as Venezuela is, an economic crisis as Venezuela is. So it is absolutely essential that corruption be fought. And all this, by the way, is just executive branch level corruption. We're not even going into judicial branch level corruption. According to Transparency International, the judicial system in Venezuela is the most corrupt in the world. And there was a Gallup poll, I think that was done in 2015, that found that 100% of Venezuelans believed that there was undue influence by corrupt government officials in their judicial system. I don't think you can get 100% of Americans to agree that broccoli doesn't taste great, but you somehow got 100% of Venezuelans to agree on this. So it just shows you the perception and the reality of how this regime is fully and totally corrupt. Now, going into more specific, the case of Alex Saab. Now, before I get to Alex Saab, I just want to also throw out one other thing here, which is if we acknowledge this as a mafia state, and we acknowledge how much money is now rolling off the top from the corruption, then how do you defeat a mafia state? Well, I personally don't know. Obviously, I had a year and a half at the White House, didn't work, so I'll acknowledge that I don't know. But I took a page out of more recently. I started looking into cases where prosecutors have gone after the actual mafia, because if this is what this is, then maybe that's where we should be learning, taking our lessons from. And I took a few notes from both Sicilian prosecutors and from New York-based prosecutors, and it seems like there's a pretty established pattern of how you defeat the mafia. You start by following the money. And I think we've started to do that in the U.S. government by going after some of these big money individuals through sanctions, but also through indictments. You then go after the smaller fish who are bound to mess up or find themselves in uncomfortable positions because they didn't realize that they were going to be sought after by a U.S. government. And then when you have that smaller fish, you get them to turn on bigger fish, and you keep moving up the chain until you get to the very top. Okay, so that's kind of how we've defeated the mafia, both in Italy and in the United States. And I'd say that's probably how we want to defeat the Venezuelan mafia state at this point. So all of that brings me to Alex Saab. Now, Alex Saab is 48 years old. He's been indicted on 8 counts here in the United States. 1 count of conspiracy to commit money laundering, which carries a 20-year maximum, and 7 counts of money laundering, which each carry 20 years. That's 140 years. So total of 160 years that he's facing in U.S. prison. Let's say that he is extradited, and let's say he gets a very, very lenient judge, somebody who, for whatever reason, wants to go very easy on him, thinks he's a good guy and didn't deserve all this. So he gets 1/3 of the sentence that he could get, 1/3. And then let's say that he spends his entire life in federal penitentiary behaving incredibly well, so that he gets the 15% maximum that federal penitentiaries are allowed to give you for good behavior. If all of that happens, which is the best case scenario for Mr. Saab, he would be facing 48 years in federal penitentiary. Now, he's 48 years old, like I said, so that's his entire lifetime. And not to prejudge his state of health and longevity, but most likely would die in federal prison. So understanding all of that and understanding what he's facing now, assuming that he's extradited, I think you have the situation that presents itself with a huge opportunity. You get Alex Saab and you tell him, hey, again, this is the best case scenario for you. You're going to die in federal jail. And that's best case scenario. And so we can make that go away, though. And what it would take is for you to collaborate, for you to talk to us, for you to explain all that you know. Now, we don't know all that he knows. We assume he knows a lot, but we don't even know. I mean, this guy, we know for a fact now. I mean, we've presented evidence that he's been involved in stealing over $350 million, and that was from the food program, a humanitarian food program, We know that he's very close with Tarek El-Assami. Tarek El-Assami, as all of you might remember, back when I was at the White House in 2017, we went after him and we seized assets in the United States valued at almost $1 billion of his, and that's just in the United States. And this guy was a public servant who supposedly had never had a job that wasn't in public service in his life. So we know he's involved with bad actors. We know he's done bad things, but we assume that he will also know a lot more about a lot more bad things happening in Venezuela. And so that's, I think, what's at stake here. I think it's a real ability to potentially turn this guy and get him to work for us in a way that would start moving us up that chain of the mafia state. That would no doubt eventually lead to the Tarek El-Assamis, to the Cabellos, and to Maduro and Cecilia Flores themselves. So finally, to answer your question, Moises, and I apologize for the length here, but I thought it was important to kind of give the context. Yes, we don't have an extradition treaty with Cape Verde. However, they have been members of Interpol since 1989, and that's why they took the action that they did, right? Interpol, there was a red notice that was issued by the United States. These are notices that say, hey, watch out, there's a wanted fugitive that we're looking for. Please, if you see them, detain them. And so Cape Verde went through with that and detained them. And now they are under no legal obligation to send, the Saab to us because there is no extradition treaty. However, according to the Interpol Charter, when there is no extradition treaty between countries, they can still work out through diplomatic channels a potential transfer, right? So I think now it's going to be a pure matter of diplomacy. And diplomacy is in some ways a zero-sum game because we don't know what Saab knows. He could know things that implicate Russia and could implicate Iran and could implicate China. So there could be other countries who are also pressuring from a diplomatic standpoint, not just the United States, right, or Colombia, but other sides of this coin. So it's a little tricky. However, what I can say, and again, this is just purely from looking at numbers here, we are in a good diplomatic position with Cape Verde. I don't know much about the country. I've never interacted with the country, but I will say that as far as trade goes, their number one exporter is the European Union, and their number two exporter is the United States. And whereas imports, the money they give, number two is China, and number three is Russia. So there is more leverage that we seem to have, and the Europeans seem to have with Cape Verde than the other way around, than the Russians and Chinese, who apparently seem to kind of need them a little bit more as far as the net gain goes. That's my take, and looking forward to answering some questions.
Awesome, thank you, Fernando. That was great. Okay, just following up on one of the things that Fernando was saying, Ambassador Neumann and Josh, maybe you want to chime in here too. The arrest of Alex Saab clearly not only takes away a Maduro ally, but also is a blow to the government's ability to prop up itself through illicit activities. And in a way, I assume this arrest will create major cash flow problems for Maduro, right?
Yes.
And especially in the last few years, we see Maduro moving towards illicit gold, drug trafficking, money laundering, and again, this is in the context of sanctions and isolating Maduro economically and financially. This also adds on that pressure campaign that the international community is trying to do, not to help the Venezuelan people and trying to alleviate the suffering. But again, how relevant do you see this case on that context, and how much of a blow is for the Maduro regime?
Hi. Well, I think this is absolutely historic for the country, the Alex Saab case, for a number of reasons. So as you know, if you read my book, I have long argued that the regime in Venezuela is actually a massive criminal organization, and it's actually that's not even a political statement. It's just a statement of fact. If you look at what motivates them, how they operate, how they move, how they're motivated by money, the people they work with, they are a criminal organization. The Venezuelan people are being oppressed and starved by criminals. Doesn't matter what your political view is. That's just a statement of fact. When you tackle transnational criminal organizations, commonly known as TCOs in security jargon, the key pieces you want to take out is not so much the capo, but the guys who are what we call the nexa, the strategic the ones who provide the critical capabilities. Alex Saab is that guy. You want to go after, when you go after, take down a criminal network, you want to destabilize those hyper connectors that are the ones that connect from the different regions and connect top to bottom and connect geopolitically. Alex Saab is that guy. You want to go after transportation, financing, and recruitment operations. That's how you take down a criminal network. Those three things and the hyperconnectors, and he's that guy. What we want also as a Venezuelan is that will really destabilize the criminal network that is the Maduro regime, and we want the oppression of the Venezuelan people to end, and we also want the money back, because don't forget, the other thing that he made a lot of money through with the CLAP and the construction is through CADIVI, which is the foreign exchange network. So he raided, and the CADIVI raided the national reserves, and now they're trying to raid the rest of the national reserves in other countries, like in England. And the irony is, he was a key figure in the pillaging of the national reserves, profiting off the suffering of the people, and increasingly criminalizing and providing those international networks for the Maduro criminal regime. So he is a key figure. It's historic, and it'll be interesting to watch how it unfolds.
Thank you, Ambassador. Josh, any comments on that? And also, I know you have been looking at Saab for at least 2 years. How long has Saab had a relationship with the Maduro regime? And we were just talking before the event that he also had a relationship in a way with the Santos administration in Colombia. They signed a Fondo Global de Construcción agreement in 2013 at least. Just give us a sense of how long has Alex Saab has been interacting with both the Maduro and the Chavez administration.
Yeah, so he becomes known publicly around 2013 in a period when President Santos and President Chavez were trying to patch things up once again. And he's sort of there at a signing ceremony in which Maduro was present as well as foreign minister. And no one really had heard of him before. And, President Santos this week again repeated that, he didn't really know who the guy was either. He was not a big name in Colombia. He was well known from Barranquilla, his hometown, but he was certainly not a titan of industry in Colombia as he became in Venezuela. And Vanessa's right. He was a logistics chief, if you want, in many ways. I mean, he has the structures that you need to deliver whatever it is you want to deliver. It is very important from that perspective, the role that he plays as a government contractor in Venezuela. I also, we don't have to get into this now, but I think what Fernando was saying is very, fascinating. I mean, the role of indictments, I think I'm a little bit reluctant to see how that really leads to the ending of Maduro, when in fact it creates in many ways a perverse incentive for them to not negotiate when they know that the end game for them is a jail cell and a long prison sentence in the U.S. And I think that's some of the dangers and some of the maybe some of the areas where the pursuit of justice conflicts with a political solution to the problem. I mean, what negotiation incentive does Maduro have? And let's face it, he has the guns, he has the power on the streets. What incentive does he have to negotiate a departure when he knows that this is what people want for him? So again, I'm not saying these indictments are unjustified by any stretch. I'm just saying that we have to wonder how they're used and calibrated to get the desired result. And the desired result is not to get Alex Saab in jail. It's obviously from the U.S. perspective to get Maduro out of power.
Yeah, that's a great point, Josh. Let's turn to you, Fernando, and kind of get your input on this. Do you think this arrest of Alex Saab in general harm or help the international community campaign to restore democracy in Venezuela and help the Venezuelan people not to restore their own democracy? How do you see that playing out?
Well, I think there's two things there. First of all, I think we have to keep the political and the judicial separate. I think that's essential for the sanctity of the systems and for the sanctity of ensuring that what we're doing here is really about, justice and not about, the whims of political leadership in Washington or elsewhere, right? So I'll say that in the U.S., we're I can't speak to what happens now, but I can say that what was supposed to happen and what was happening certainly when I was there in 2017 and 2018 is that the White House and the Justice Department cannot talk, literally cannot talk about potential indictments. That is a line that is not crossed ever. And so, whatever is happening based on the evidence that has been, gathered by folks at the Justice Department working with the FBI or CIA or whoever else they can to gather that information, is then presented to a independent grand jury. A group of random Americans were selected and the evidence is put in front of them, and they have to say that there is enough evidence there to issue an indictment. And that's how an indictment is issued, right? There's no involvement from the executive branch, from the White House or the political side, the State Department. In fact, there maybe is like a 1 or 2 hour heads up that the indictment will be released publicly, but it's not even, a 2-day heads up. Which honestly I always thought was weird because it affects very much directly our political calculations. So I think it would be helpful from the political side to understand what is going on in the judicial side. But I also fully respect that boundary that exists, and I think it's the right one to exist because we need to keep those separate. So having said that, how does this affect? I think we can't, force indictments or prevent indictments. Again, I think when that evidence presents itself, we should let it happen. Because that's how our judicial system works. But it will, like I said, affect the political side, no doubt. I think it's a good thing for the people of Venezuela, in my personal opinion. I think for them to see that justice is being sought, for evidence to be presented of things that many Venezuelans have been saying publicly for decades now, for there finally to be kind of evidence out there publicly, saying that, again, in an independent court of law, an independent grand jury of random Americans said that, yes, this evidence presents enough, not to say that he's guilty, but to say that an indictment is warranted. I think it really kind of backs up the people of Venezuela. I think it sends a message to the world from an independent judiciary that is relatively respected still today, that evidence exists, that this isn't just some political whim coming out of Washington that, say a future administration might not support or might want to go in a different direction. This is a judicial independent matter. So I think that's a positive sign for the world. And it does change the calculations from the political angle, no doubt, to Josh's point. Of course, it's a whole different negotiation when and if there's an indictment out there for Maduro or something like that. So you have to be cognizant of that from the political angle. But I think that those processes have to work independently. And I think there are solutions to everything, right? I mean, I don't think Maduro expects that even without any indictments or anything, that one day he'll be, retiring to Miami Beach. So if he's going to have to go to Havana or Siberia, chances are an indictment won't hit him there either. So I think it doesn't, there are some changes to the calculation, but it doesn't, I think, probably fundamentally change the end game.
Great, thank you. Okay, great. Let's move on to Q&A from the audience. I start getting a lot of questions here. Ambassador, let's start with you. You represent the interim government of Venezuela in the UK and Ireland. And for those who don't follow us closely, Juan Guaido leads the interim government. He's the head of the National Assembly, the last remaining institution, democratic institution in the country, and is recognized by at least 60 countries as the legitimate president of Venezuela. So what the role of the interim government, Ambassador, can play in this case? Like, where do you see that playing? Because we're talking about the US, talking about other countries, but what about the interim government?
Okay, well, as I said at the outset, it's very important that this judicial process follow a judicial process. This is a criminal being convicted for crimes of money laundering and corruption, etc. And we need to let that go. It would be a mistake to politicize it. However, the role of the interim government, what we can do and is our obligation to do for the Venezuelan people, is to demand that stolen money be put into a secure pot. and become part of the future of the reconstruction of Venezuela. He is a key figure in the massive theft that has actually decimated the country. And what we would want as an interim government is to have some of those wrongs redressed and have some of that money returned and safeguarded, and eventually become the seed money for things for the rebuilding of Venezuela once we have a system with free and fair elections. So that is the number one. And also it is important for, as the interim government, for our people, the Venezuelan people that we represent, to understand that, as Fernando Kut said, that people care about them, that the people who are oppressing them do not have their best interests at heart and have just been increasingly, as I said before, profiting from their suffering. The suffering has become good business. What we need to do is to make Venezuelan prosperity for our people good business. So that is our role, is to change that paradigm, to get back what belongs to the people and to take care of them. That is the role of the interim government. We are trustees for democracy until we get to free and fair elections, and we keep building from there.
Thank you, Ambassador. Josh, Fernando, I have another question, this time from Michael Camilleri from the Inter-American Dialogue. He says, the transition framework posits that the International Criminal Court referral for crimes against humanity committed by the Maduro regime will be withdrawn. What is the reason for this, and did the countries involved agree on this point? So any of you have any insights on this question?
That's a question for the American government representative, I think.
Yeah, which we don't have today here, but Fernando, yeah, or Josh.
Could you repeat it one more time, Moises? Sorry.
Sure. The question was, the transition framework, which is the State Department transition framework that they posted, a couple of months ago, includes that the International Criminal Court referral for crimes against humanity committed by the Maduro regime will be withdrawn. What do you think is the reason for this? And did the countries involved agree on this issue?
Got it. Yeah, again, I can't speak to the reality of the current U.S. government's decisions or what they're thinking or diplomatic engagements are. My best guess here is that there is and I think this has become evident recently through the sanctions applied against the International Criminal Court judges, that there is a strong dislike in the Trump administration for the ICC. So I would assume that this is part of their way to express that dislike in the Venezuela issue. I will say in 2017 and 2018, we were encouraging other countries to actually submit complaints to the ICC. We encouraged Venezuelan opposition or dissidents who would come to us with evidence of torture or other issues to gather that and submit that to the ICC. We certainly thought it was worthy for the international community to see that evidence and to kind of have that out there. Again, I think the more that you can expose the world to facts, the better. And whether that's at the ICC, the OAS, the UN, the EU, or wherever you want to go, I think the more facts out there, the better, because the facts support the people of Venezuela. They do not support Maduro. I mean, that's just plain and simple. So I'd say be as transparent as possible, be as outgoing as possible, and try to use all of the multinational bodies, in my opinion. But again, I am not speaking for the government.
Yeah, thank you, Fernando.
If I can add one quick thing, I think also if you look at the what the democratic transition framework is designed to do, it's designed to give incentives for an off-ramp, right? What Josh was saying, that they don't have the incentive or the off-ramp, etc. This is the off-ramp, and it has very clear markers. Every time, for every step that the Maduro regime takes in favor of democracy, they will be rewarded by those sanctions being lifted. Dissolve the fake Supreme Court, dissolve the fake, the illegitimate National Assembly. So basically, I believe, I'm not the American government who drafted this, but basically what had previously been the criticism was that the CPI in Spanish, ICC in English, does not provide an off-ramp. When you are convicted of crimes against humanity, there is no negotiation, right? So if the program is designed to provide an incentive to negotiation, that is, I believe, it is my understanding that that is the thinking behind perhaps pushing those charges forward to increase the incentive to an off-ramp.
Yeah, thank you. On that point, Josh, I think you made an interesting point earlier, saying something like, you know, the threat to send to criminal actors to jail within the Maduro regime may be an incentive to you know, perhaps to hesitate and give up power, right? And I have a question from Tamara Herrera from CSIS Financiera, and she's asking, is it realistic to expect that the Alex Saab case give incentive to negotiate if the threat of conviction is so high? So in a way, the question is kind of reversed. Is this will maybe help Maduro regime to negotiate any exit ramp at all if the threat of conviction is high? What do you think?
I think it's a fair debate whether, you know, having a gun on the table helps or hurts negotiation. So I'm not trying to weigh in on one way or the other, but it's an important debate to have, in the sense that, you know, the goal from the US perspective is clearly regime change. And, you know, these indictments, despite the fact that they are separate processes, and again, like I said, that the integrity of the law enforcement officials in the US, you know, does not seem to be impinged. There needs to, that always needs to be it needs to be clear what the goal is. And again, it's not just, you know, get these guys into jail, but that politically, like I was saying, is very popular. I mean, everyone got social media. I was crazily busy last weekend when Alex Saab was arrested in Cape Verde, and, you know, there was a lot of celebratory, you know, sentiments on social media. One thing to consider, I've been reading and talking a lot to people involved in the Panama case, Operation Just Cause. You know, after they indicted Noriega, they actually, I think it was Bernie Aronson and Elliot Abrams. Well, no, it wasn't Abrams. I think it was Bernie Aronson and others, maybe Michael Kozak. They did make an additional offer of him to sort of bow out and go to Spain. It was a different time. The ICC didn't exist, and, you know, this is very, very different era. But it's worth noting that he did have options of a nice exile even after he was indicted. So, you know, to your point, Moises, the indictment is not necessarily, you know, a straight to jail card and, you know, there's nothing to negotiate. There are solutions, and there's lots of countries. Look at what's happening now in Colombia, the FARC leaders. The US has not lifted any of their drug indictments against the 60 or so FARC rebels who've been accused of drug trafficking. Are they really in threat of arrest? Only if they break their promises to the accord. But the US has maintained the integrity of its system by keeping the indictments in place. So there are creative solutions, but they require, you know, some very careful diplomacy, and obviously the indictments are a complicating factor in any negotiation.
Thank you. Thanks, Josh. Ambassador, back to you. I have another interesting question here. You know, on this context of what Fernando was saying earlier, you know, one of the biggest challenges in Venezuela is that we're dealing in a way with a mafia state, no, where there are many organized crime actors involved. So Geoff Ramsey from World is asking, how unique is Alex Saab, and is his arrest is really a silver bullet? Isn't it likely there are other Saabs or others who engage in these same activities that will be happy to take his place in the Maduro regime in a way? What do you think about that? And Fernando, I have another question for you too.
All right, you're getting into one of my preferred fields. You know, how do you do asymmetric warfare against transnational criminal organizations? I like it. Basically, and I repeat, Maduro is a transnational criminal organization. Basically, is it a silver bullet? No, but it's a start. So when you go after, are there other Alex Saabs? Yes, but not many. Not many at this level, not many that are that trusted. As I said, he's the go-to guy, right? They did it with the construction, they've done it with the clap, they did it with the oil for food, now they're doing it with the gold for gasoline. Like all of these schemes, he knows who to call in Iran, who to call in Turkey, how to set up a business in Panama, lickety split. Not many people have that skill set or that Rolodex. and that loyalty, and makes that profitability for them. So there aren't that many. Will other people take his place? Yes, absolutely. Usually if you go hard after a transnational criminal organization, you take out nodes like him, bring him to heel, negotiate, and take advantage of the fact that you have a window of opportunity where the network is destabilized. And that's when you swoop in and take action. I don't know whether this will move that swiftly. As I said, there are political considerations, which I'm completely laying aside, but usually that's how you do it. You pick up Saab, if you can pick up someone like Saab, interrogate him and go after his associated nodes, you have an opportunity to destabilize the broader network. So there is an opportunity for this to be the event that really brings the Maduro transnational criminal organization to heel. Will that happen? There are too many factors to know whether that will actually happen.
Can I add one thing, Moises?
Sure, yeah.
You know, it's very interesting. We don't know the story. I would love to know it myself, you know, how he was caught, who betrayed him, if he was betrayed. And I think, you know, we all are analyzing this from the perspective of the US, looking at Alex Saab and fighting, you know, crime in Venezuela. But I can tell you, there were plenty of people. Alex Saab was a divisive figure even within Chavismo. You'll notice, I have not seen, I could be wrong, there was not any sign of support for him from Diosdado Cabello. And the statement that Foreign Minister Arriaza released, hitching in many ways the government's, you know, fate to Alex Saab, saying that he was a government agent, the first time we've seen that. These are very important statements that need to be, you know, considered and show both the importance that Vanessa talks about, but you know, this may be something that could come back to haunt them at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. Fernando, you point out that corruption is pervasive in Venezuela, right? And I think it's been part of this discussion. It's, as you said, I think it's not just in the executive branch, but also we've seen corruption playing out in the judiciary branch in Venezuela. Now, moving beyond indictments, what tools does the international community have at its disposal? And it's not the first time I'm asking you this question, to tackle corruption, the corruption problem specifically. What do you think is out there beyond indictments to tackle this?
Yeah, well, thank you, Moises. And you know, that's the question that, again, we've been trying to answer, I think, for many, many years. Predates certainly this administration and probably even maybe the prior administration. It's unfortunately a real problem that we've dealt with in Venezuela, and probably, and I'm sure, I'm not an expert in other countries in the world, but I'm sure in other countries in the world. When you have a corrupt regime that really cares about itself more than it cares about its people, that cares about its survival and its ability to remain in power more than anything else, it makes it very, very tough, because they're willing to cross red lines that we wouldn't assume, you know, in our way of thinking, that regimes would be willing to cross. You know, when we saw Maduro really go from kind of being a disliked president to a dictator, you know, that basically ignored democracy, that didn't allow for free and fair elections, but that decided he was going to stay in power. Well, that, you know, so what do you do then? I mean, you know, your levers, the levers you can pull are taken away from you more and more as you realize just how kind of bold-faced the regime is and how willing they are to just kind of do anything to stay in power. So admittedly, the options are somewhat limited. You get to a point, at least, where the options are somewhat limited. However, what I think we all could do, continue to work on and do a better job of as an international community, is to really focus on the money that goes into Venezuela, seeing how we could be paying it to the people of Venezuela in a better way that doesn't allow for that scheme off the top, you know, and so whether that is utilizing the UN or the OAS or the Lima Group or some other entity that is yet to be created, but or you know, the Red Cross or the Catholic Church or whatever it is, but somehow getting that money that needs to go into for the people of Venezuela, you know, through food programs, through humanitarian assistance and medicine and whatnot. And also, you know, to pay as payment for different things that people are buying, different countries are buying that are still coming out of Venezuela. That all needs to be spent in a better way that doesn't allow for this, you know, skimming off the top and really goes straight to the people. That's unfortunately the only thing that I've thought of in recent months And it's not perfect, but I think it's what we have to work on right now.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we only have about 5 minutes, so let's start getting wrapped up. I have another interesting question here, maybe for you, Josh. I mean, you're an investigative journalist, and I know it's not directly linked to civil society, but I think you can maybe give us some insights on this. Someone is asking, is there anything that the Venezuelan civil society could do in order to influence judicial authorities in Cabo Verde to extradite Alex Saab, for example, by disseminating information? Is that a worthwhile effort? What do you think about that?
I think it's an inevitable effort, and it's sort of the muddying of the waters here, and what's a judicial process, which obviously has very serious political connotations. But you know, what we all hope is that the judges in Cabo Verde, like the prosecutors in the U.S., will look at the evidence and follow strictly the law. All the noise from civil society, politicians, it's just inevitable from the time we live in all around the world. I don't think, there's anything we should do to stop that, but it's not what should be deciding any of these cases. My sense is that the prosecutors as well in these cases, they don't like, that's an insignificant part of their case. Almost doesn't even exist. They focus squarely on the evidence, and that's what they should do. So, everyone's going to weaponize this, and you saw it from the government as well. So, they're all going to put a spin on it, and that's just what it is. And it'll probably generate a lot of noise and headlines and whatnot, but it's not what should be deciding, what should happen.
If I could just add one thing, Moses, on that, I think one interesting point. I also don't know much about Cabo Verde at all, so at all. But one interesting point to me is that they decided to arrest him. We don't know what information, what tip led to them knowing that he was going to be there. But I think it's very, very easy for a government to get that information that the plane was going to be stopping for a fuel stop and that somebody was inside that was wanted somewhere that they don't have an extradition treaty with, and to turn a blind eye to that and to say, oh, sorry, by the time we sent the police out there, the plane was gone, right? I mean, easy to do, done all the time, unfortunately, even with countries that have extradition treaties with us. The fact that they decided to go through and actually arrest him was, a decision that was probably made at a high level relatively within the country, again, not knowing much about the politics there. And to me is indicative that they are at least somewhat willing to consider the next steps that come with an arrest in this case, right? So I do lean towards the optimistic side and thinking that there is probably some serious consideration going on, of course, to this, but that an arrest could have easily not happened here. And it would now be a lot uglier to let him go than it would have been if they had just not done the arrest in the first place.
Yeah, that's a good point. Ambassador, let's conclude with you. We have only 1 minute and a half. Maybe, this is a tough question to responding within a minute, but I mean, we've seen a lot of actors internationally playing out in Venezuela, right? We know there's Russia, China interest in Venezuela. We know Iran, Turkey plays an important role. You study this issue from your professional career a long time ago, and including on your book. What do you see playing out? It's not only a U.S., Colombia. It's a bigger issue, and do you see any interference from other countries on this issue? Quickly, again, we have 30 seconds.
Absolutely. Of course, you're going to have interference from other countries. And remember what I started with, is that the problem with corruption is that it provides an entry point for foreign interest. Corruption is not just paying money to the government, but is actually an entry point for other countries to influence those actors to turn against the people, which is exactly what has happened in Venezuela. Alex Saab knows where all these other money, so on the other side, they are also criminals, a lot of those people. So they have an interest in protecting him as much as Maduro does. So there's the Iranian and the Turkish partners, and the Chinese who are also in the background with those Mahaneer shipments, and Russia. So they will try to protect him as well, which is a reason why I've been careful about the words I have chosen today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Jose Fernando. That was a fascinating discussion. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of feedback. And again, we're going to be publishing a commentary about this issue next week, and we hope that our audience also enjoy it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.